I was showing 3 new interns around the office when a strange, disembodied voice suddenly echoed in my mind. This woman is the male lead's ninth canary. Doesn't that make her the villainous rival? Standing in my way, locked away in an asylum. In the end, classic villainous fate. Wait. My first meeting with the male lead is about to happen. She better not ruin it for me. My steps faltered for a fraction of a second. I turned back, offering a polite smile to the 3 interns. You girls might want to tie your hair back, I said softly. The CEO hates it when women leave their hair loose. Ruin it for her? Far from it. I'd gladly hand over every single one of my benefactor's quirks and preferences on a silver platter to this self-proclaimed heroine. After all, nobody wanted the arrival of the 10th canary more than I did. During my advice, the 3 girls paused, immediately reaching up to tidy their hair. One of them, a girl named Daisy Campbell, kept her eyes lowered, the tips of her ears flushed a faint pink, and she offered a shy, polite smile.
Thank you, Miss Nancy.
Yet her inner voice crashed into my mind with crystal clarity. What's with the sudden kindness? There's got to be a catch. The chat says she's the classic villainess, always playing dirty behind people's backs. I can't let her play me for a fool. Thank God I have this live feed. I kept walking, the smile on my face fading slightly. A quiet amusement settled in my chest. Let her think what she wanted. I just wanted her to secure her place quickly, so I could finally be replaced. As we approached the main office floor, Daisy's mental voice grew increasingly frantic and unhinged. What is going on? Why does every single female employee have their hair up? In the hallways, the break room, the cubicles? Not a single loose strand.
Ugh.
Why is the chat feed only telling me now that the CEO despises loose hair? She was actually helping me. She instinctively reached up, running her fingers through her loose, long hair, her eyes darting around in a panic. We entered the elevator, ascending to the executive suite. At the end of the long corridor was the CEO's private office. Addison Pierce stepped out just as we arrived. Impeccable in a tailored black suit, he stood tall and imposing. His gaze swept over the group, finally lingering on Daisy. The look in his eyes was entirely different from the way he usually looked at me. There was a spark of undeniable predatory interest. Daisy froze, her fingers clutching the hem of her blazer. Mentally, she was screaming, "It's happening. Our first official frame together. He's looking at me. He really is." The feed was right. We are absolutely destiny. Addison didn't linger. He turned to me, his tone characteristically cool. "Once you're done showing the new hires around, come to my office," I nodded. Of course, Daisy remained quiet and cooperative throughout, but she kept gravitating toward me, her eyes drifting toward the executive suite. Whenever she thought I wasn't looking, the young always believed the world was simpler than it was. That evening I returned to the estate. Addison arrived shortly after. He didn't wrap his arms around me as he usually did, nor did he ask if my day had been exhausting. There was no touch, no warmth. Instead, he sat on the leather sofa, turning an unlit cigarette between his fingers, acting entirely casual. That new intern, Daisy Campbell, what do you think of her? Here it comes. I kept my face perfectly blank, taking a slow sip from my glass of water. She seems sweet, quiet, unspoiled. Unspoiled? He looked up, his gaze probing my face. That's all. I lowered my eyes, my fingers tracing the rim of the glass. I let my voice soften, injecting a faint, carefully measured note of hurt and insecurity into my tone. What else do you want me to say? She's fresh out of college, young and vibrant, unlike me. I've been with you for years, Addison. I'm sure the novelty wore off a long time ago. A flash of irritation crossed Addison's eyes. Fast and cold. Go get some rest, he said, his voice dropping several degrees. Without another word, he stood up and walked upstairs, never looking back. I sat in the quiet living room, watching his retreating figure with absolute indifference. Perfect. The more annoyed he was with me, the faster this transition would go. Over the next few days, the shift in Addison's behavior became glaringly obvious. He stopped requesting my presence for lunch, choosing instead to eat at the corporate cafeteria. And, by sheer coincidence, Daisy always seemed to cross paths with him there. Sometimes she would sit across from him with her tray, acting clumsy and flustered. Other times, she would bring a notebook to ask for professional advice, her demeanor perfectly balancing innocence and eagerness. Whenever she passed my desk, Daisy would cast a lingering look in my direction. It was a look of unshielded amusement laced with a patronizing pity. She kept repeating the same thoughts like a mantra. So sad. She's about to be discarded. Why did she have to stand in my way? Look at the miserable end she's heading toward. I kept my head down, ignoring her completely. Soon enough, she would realize who the pitiable one really was. As the weeks bled into one another, Addison's fascination with Daisy became public knowledge. The office rumors spread like wildfire. There wasn't a soul in the building who didn't know that the new intern was receiving special attention from the billionaire CEO. The gossip was discussed in the break rooms, the elevators, and the private group chats. A few days later, the Real bomb dropped. HR issued a formal announcement. Daisy Campbell's probation period was waived, and she was promoted to a full-time position, effective immediately. But the real shocker was her new assignment. Addison had personally instructed HR to transfer her to the executive suite as his personal assistant's aide. All eyes naturally turned to me. Some looked with curiosity, others with pity, and a few with naked amusement, waiting for me to shatter. On the day Daisy moved her things to the executive suite, she made a conscious detour to pass my desk. Her mind was practically screaming in triumph. Look at that. I'm in the executive office now. One step closer. The feed is spot on. She's getting dumped. Eventually she'll lose her mind and end up in a psych ward. Perfect villainous ending. Look at her trying to act calm. Hilarious. None of them knew the truth. I wasn't grieving. In fact, my chest was tight with an excitement so intense. I could barely breathe. I was finally reaching the end. I was finally going to be free of Addison Pierce. Once Daisy settled into the executive suite, her relationship with Addison accelerated at an alarming pace. Many of the events and high-profile meetings that used to be my exclusive domain were now handed to her. The only exceptions were the late-night business dinners, where heavy drinking was required. Addison still insisted on bringing me. The reason was simple. I could hold my liquor, and Daisy couldn't. Daisy didn't mind this arrangement. In fact, she saw it as a sign of her own elevation. Her inner thoughts grew sweeter, more confident by the day. He can't live without me now. He consults me on everything. The feed says I'm his lucky charm, that I'll help him reach new heights once I secure my place. That woman is history. Armed with the spoilers from her mental feed, she began subtly advising him on upcoming projects, steering him toward lucrative municipal contracts. Before they even went public, within months, the entire company was singing her praises, calling her Addison's indispensable partner. Addison's satisfaction with her was absolute. His visits to my estate grew sparser, until eventually they ceased altogether. He either stayed late with Daisy, or retreated to his private penthouse downtown. The sprawling, suburban villa he had bought for me became nothing more than a quiet, empty cage. I welcomed the silence. The less I saw of him, the safer I felt. On Valentine's Day, the city was practically dripping with manufactured romance. Daisy was in a state of high anxiety and excitement. All day her mind kept looping the same thought. The feed says he's proposing tonight. I can't wait. What kind of ring did he get? I'm going crazy. That evening, Addison indeed took Daisy to the city's most exclusive rooftop restaurant. I was there too, sitting alone in a dim corner, slowly nursing a glass of Cabernet. From across the candlelit room, I watched Addison sink to one knee. Retrieving a velvet box from his pocket, he murmured something to her. Daisy's eyes welled with tears as she nodded frantically, throwing her arms around his neck. They kissed as the surrounding patrons erupted into polite applause. I watched from the shadows, my fingers tightening around the stem of my glass. The cold glass sent a chill straight to my chest. If he had proposed, then my sentence was served. I could leave. But that night, Addison seemed to have forgotten my existence entirely. I waited in the corner until the restaurant closed, receiving nothing. The next morning, Daisy floated into the office, her face glowing with a sweet, arrogant pride. She walked past my desk, her gaze brushing over me with casual disdain. Just a harmless villainess. He doesn't even deserve my attention. Since she didn't actually manage to hurt me, there's no need to destroy her. I'll just have Addison fire her, give her some severance, and send her on her way. Sure enough, that very evening, Addison brought Daisy to the villa. He stood in the center of the living room, looking sharp and untouchable in his designer suit. His voice was flat, devoid of any warmth or history. There's a black card on the table. The balance is more than enough to ensure you never have to work again. Hand in your resignation tomorrow and leave the city. There was no negotiation, no lingering affection. I looked at him, forcing a look of quiet heartbreak and submission onto my face, while my chest hammered with absolute joy. Okay, you understand. Daisy stood beside him, her eyes narrowing as she watched me with sharp suspicion. Is she planning something? The feed says she'll pretend to agree. but stabbed me in the back. She couldn't help but speak up, her voice laced with warning. You better not try any tricks, Nancy. Don't think about revenge, or things will get very ugly for you. I looked up, letting my gaze rest on her face for a moment before giving a small, weary smile. Don't worry. I don't have the stomach or the courage for that. If it makes you feel safer, I added, pack my bags and buy a ticket tonight. You can watch me go through security. Daisy blinked, clearly caught off guard by my compliance. She calculated the risks quickly in her head, then nodded. Fine. Let's do that. I didn't waste another second. I packed a single suitcase. Under their watchful eyes, I purchased a ticket for the nearest outbound flight and walked through the security gates. Daisy let out a visible sigh of relief, wrapping her arm around Addison's as they turned to leave. Perfect. The villainous is gone. My happily ever after begins. I watched their retreating figures through the glass. Once they disappeared into the crowd, I booked a flight to a completely different destination. The transit lounge of the Munich International Airport was bathed in a sterile, fluorescent hum. I sat by a window watching the ground crew guide a massive Boeing 777 toward the runway. In my hand was the black card Addison had left on the villa's mahogany table. It was heavy, cool to the touch, and bore his surname in sleek, silver lettering. To anyone else, it was a golden ticket to a lifetime of leisure. To me, it was a GPS tracker wrapped in plastic. I walked over to the trash receptacle near the duty-free shops, dropped the card inside, and watched it disappear beneath a discarded coffee cup. Addison Pierce was a man of absolute control. He believed that money could buy silence, but more than that, he believed it could buy compliance. If I had refused the card, he would have suspected a lingering attachment, a hidden motive, or a potential threat of blackmail. By taking it, I had played the role of the defeated, greedy mistress perfectly. And by discarding it the moment I was out of his line of sight, I severed the final thread he had to my life. My real savings did not reside in a black card. Over the 5 years I spent in Addison's orbit, I had quietly, meticulously diverted a portion of the personal allowance he gave me into a series of offshore accounts under my maternal grandmother's maiden name. I never touched the money, never made large withdrawals, and never invested in anything that would trigger a flag on his corporate radar. It was a modest sum compared to his billions, but it was clean, and it was entirely mine. I boarded a flight to Zurich, Switzerland. The Zurich of my memory was cold, clean, and silent. I checked into a small, unassuming boutique hotel near the Limmat River under the name Evelyn Vance, a identity I had prepared 3 years ago just in case. As I lay on the crisp white sheets of the hotel bed, the silence of the room felt almost physical. For 5 years, my mind had been a battlefield of hypervigilance, constantly parsing Addison's moods, navigating his shifting preferences, and lately, enduring the chaotic, high-pitched static of Daisy Campbell's mental live feed. Now there was nothing. No footsteps in the hallway of the estate, no cold commands over the phone, and no frantic, unhinged commentary from a self-proclaimed heroine. I closed my eyes and slept for 14 hours straight. When I woke, the sun was casting a pale, winter light across the wooden floorboards. I dressed in a simple wool coat and went downstairs to a nearby cafe. Over a cup of black coffee, I opened my laptop and searched the corporate news of the Pierce Group. The headlines were already shifting. Pierce Group secures landmark Greenfield municipal contract. The rise of Daisy Campbell, from intern to key strategist. A photo accompanied the article. Daisy stood beside Addison, her hand resting lightly on his arm, a brilliant, triumphant smile on her face. Her hair was tied back in a neat, professional ponytail, the very advice I had given her on her first day. Beside her, Addison looked as imposing as ever, though there was a subtle tension in his jaw that only someone who had studied him for years would notice. I zoomed in on Daisy's face. She looked radiant, but her eyes possessed that familiar, manic gleam of someone who believed they were holding the script to the universe. The feed is spot on. I could almost hear her mental voice echoing in my memory. I am his lucky charm. I took a slow sip of my coffee. I knew the Greenfield project. I had spent 2 years reviewing the preliminary environmental reports before Addison shelved it. The land was heavily contaminated with industrial waste from a defunct chemical plant, and the cleanup costs alone would bleed any developer dry. The municipal government had been looking for a fool to take it off their hands for years. But Daisy, armed with her live feed spoilers, had apparently convinced Addison. that the government was planning a massive subsidy package that would offset the cleanup costs and turn the area into a high-end commercial hub. She didn't understand that the subsidies were a political bait-and-switch. In the real world, political promises faded with the next election cycle, but legally binding cleanup liabilities remained forever. I closed the laptop. The stage was set. The 10th canary had not just entered the cage. She had locked the door from the inside and thrown away the key. To understand why the canaries ended up in asylums, one had to understand the true nature of the Pierce Group's financial architecture. Addison Pierce did not build his empire on pure business acumen. He built it on a cycle of high-risk leverage, political bribery, and strategic scapegoating. Every few years, when the debt became too heavy or a regulatory body began sniffing too close to the foundation, a canary would emerge. The first canary was Clara. She had been his administrative assistant 10 years ago, when a major tax evasion scandal threatened to shut down the company's shipping division. Clara was suddenly revealed to have mismanaged millions of dollars due to severe psychological distress. She signed a full confession, was declared mentally unfit to stand trial, and was quietly moved to a private sanatorium in upstate New York, funded entirely by a trust set up by the Pierce Group. The third canary was Evelyn. She had been his fiancée. When a high-rise construction project collapsed due to substandard materials, Evelyn was the one who had signed the procurement orders. She suffered a nervous breakdown shortly after, claiming Addison had forced her to sign them. No one believed her. The media painted her as a greedy, unstable woman who was trying to drag a brilliant businessman down with her. She, too, vanished into a private facility. I was the ninth. For 5 years, I watched this pattern with a cold, paralyzing terror. I realized very early on that if I tried to run, Addison would simply trigger the trap he had laid for me. He had already placed my name on several shell companies and minor corporate accounts. If I showed any sign of rebellion, those accounts would suddenly show signs of fraudulent activity, and I would be faced with a choice: prison or the sanatorium. So, I became the perfect submissive partner. I never touched the corporate accounts. I never signed a single document without having my own independent, secret legal counsel review it. I played the role of the quiet, insecure woman who only cared about his affection, thereby convincing him that I was too weak and dependent to ever be a threat. But I also knew I couldn't stay forever. The cycle was inevitable. Eventually, the debt would mount again, or a project would fail, and he would need to sacrifice the 9th canary. That was when Daisy Campbell arrived. Daisy was not just a naive intern, she was an anomaly. She possessed a strange, invisible system that she called her live feed. I could hear her thoughts. Because of a childhood accident, a severe concussion that left me with an oversensitized neural pathway, allowing me to perceive high-amplitude electromagnetic fluctuations from nearby brains, particularly those undergoing intense stress or cognitive dissonance. Daisy's system operated on a very specific high-frequency neural loop that resonated perfectly with my sensory anomaly. I heard her chat, instructing her, advising her, and giving her spoilers. The chat told her that I was the villainous rival who was destined to end up in an asylum. It told her that Addison was her destined male lead who was cold on the outside but possessed a heart of gold. It was the perfect illusion. Daisy believed she was playing a game with a pre-written happy ending. Because of this, she was entirely fearless. She didn't look at the legal clauses of the document she signed. She didn't double-check the financial projections of the Greenfield project. She trusted her live feed more than she trusted reality. And Addison, sensing her absolute, uncritical devotion and her bizarre, seemingly clairvoyant knowledge of upcoming projects, moved her into position. He didn't love her. He was simply preparing his next shield. 3 months passed. I settled into a quiet routine in Zurich. I rented a small apartment overlooking the lake, took language classes, and spent my afternoons walking through the botanical gardens. For the first time in my adult life, my shoulders didn't ache with tension, but I kept a close eye on the news. In late May, the first cracks in the Pierce Group's facade began to appear. The local government of the Greenfield district underwent a sudden, unexpected leadership change. The reformist mayor who had promised the massive subsidy package was ousted in a corruption scandal. The new administration, eager to distance itself from the previous regime's shady dealings, immediately announced a strict review of all active municipal contracts. I sat in my apartment, translating a Swiss financial journal's analysis of the situation. The Pierce Group faces severe penalties as greenfield cleanup costs soar 300% above initial estimates. The subsidiary responsible for the contract, Campbell Enterprises, is currently under investigation for environmental noncompliance. Campbell Enterprises. I leaned back in my chair, a small, grim smile touching my lips. Addison had set up a subsidiary in Daisy's name to handle the greenfield project. He had convinced her that it was a gesture of his love, a way to make her an independent businesswoman and his equal partner. And Daisy, egged on by her live feed, had signed every single document with absolute pride. I opened my private email. I had set up a secure, encrypted Dropbox years ago, containing all the evidence I had quietly gathered during my 5 years with Addison. It included records of his meetings with the previous Greenfield mayor, the original environmental reports showing the true extent of the contamination, and copies of the internal memos showing that Addison was fully aware of the financial risks but chose to push the contract through a shell company anyway. But the most critical piece of evidence was something I had acquired during my final week at the villa. Addison kept a private ledger in a hidden safe behind the painting in his study. He believed I didn't know the code, but I had watched the reflection in the polished glass of the liquor cabinet one night while pretending to be asleep on the sofa. Inside that safe was a list of all his previous canaries and the specific financial transactions used to frame them. I hadn't taken the ledger. That would have alerted him immediately. Instead, I had used a high-resolution microcamera disguised as a pen to copy every page. I drafted an email to a senior investigator at the federal prosecutor's office in New York who had been quietly trying to build a case against the Pierce Group for years, but had always run into a wall of sealed documents and unstable witnesses. Dear Investigator Miller, I believe you are currently looking into the Pierce Group's involvement in the Greenfield Municipal Project. You will find attached a series of documents that may clarify the true corporate hierarchy and the systematic use of proxy signatures to evade environmental and financial liability. The truth is not in the public filings. It is in the pattern. Sincerely, a friend of the Canaries. I hit send. In New York, the summer heat was oppressive, but inside the executive suite of the Pierce Group, the air was freezing. Daisy Campbell stood in front of Addison's desk, her hands trembling as she held a copy of the federal subpoena. Her hair, which she had so proudly kept tied back for months, was now a disheveled mess, strands clinging to her sweaty forehead. Addison, what is this? Her voice was high and panicked. The FBI, they were at my apartment this morning. They said Campbell Enterprises is being investigated for conspiracy to commit wire fraud and environmental negligence. They said I could face 15 years. Addison didn't look up from his tablet. His expression was as smooth and unreadable as dark water. It's a standard regulatory inquiry, Daisy, he said, his tone cool and dismissive. My legal team is handling it. But they said my signature is on the bribe payments to the former mayor's chief of staff. Daisy cried, stepping closer to the desk. I don't even know who that is. You gave me those papers to sign. You said they were authorization forms for the groundbreaking ceremony. Addison finally raised his eyes. There was no warmth in them, no predatory interest, no destined spark. There was only the cold, calculating look of a man looking at a broken tool. You signed them, Daisy, he said softly. You are the CEO of Campbell. Entity. You had the fiduciary duty to review any document before putting your name to it. If you failed to do so, that is a matter of professional negligence. Mentally, Daisy's mind was a howling vortex of terror. No, no, no. This isn't how it's supposed to go. She was screaming inside her head, the mental feedback so violent it would have given me a migraine even from miles away. Where's the chat? Why is the feed glitching? Help me. Someone help. Me. The live feed, in her mind, once a source of smug superiority, was now a chaotic mess of static and hostile text. Host has entered the ruined path. Warning. Male lead's affection meter has dropped to 0%. The villainous escape route was triggered. Host is currently holding the scapegoat flag. Is this a bad ending? Oh my god. She's going to jail, lol. The chat says she's the classic villainous, always playing dirty. Wait, who's the villainous now? Addison, please, Daisy sobbed, reaching out to touch his arm. We're engaged. We're supposed to get married in the spring. You promised me. Addison stood up, calmly brushing her hand off his sleeve. He walked over to the window looking out over the city skyline. I think the stress of the promotion has been too much for you, Daisy, he said, his back to her. You've been acting erratic lately, talking to yourself, claiming to hear voices. I've already spoken to a specialist, a private facility, in Vermont. It's very quiet there. It will give you the time you need to recover. Daisy froze, her eyes widening in absolute horror. A private facility, the asylum. The words of her own mental feed from months ago echoed in her mind. Eventually, she'll lose her mind and end up in a psych ward. Perfect villainous ending. She realized, with a sickening drop in her stomach, that the villainous rival she had been so eager to defeat was never Nancy. Nancy had been the occupant of the cage before her, and Nancy had simply stepped aside, politely holding the door open so Daisy could slide her own neck into the noose. You? Daisy whispered, her voice cracking. Nancy, she knew. She knew this would happen. Nancy was smart, Addison said, his voice devoid of emotion. She knew when to stay quiet. She knew how to play her part. You, Daisy, became too ambitious. You thought you were my partner. But I don't need a partner. I need a shield. He turned back to face her, his face a mask of polite pity. The car is waiting downstairs, Daisy. 2 medical professionals are accompanying it. For your own safety, I suggest you go quietly. The private sanatorium in Vermont, known as the Whispering Pines, was nestled in a scenic valley, surrounded by ancient maple trees and high, stone walls topped with discreet security cameras. To the public, it was an exclusive retreat for the wealthy to recover from exhaustion. To Addison Pierce, it was his personal vault for inconvenient truths. But on a crisp autumn morning in October, the gates of the sanatorium did not open for a new patient. They opened for a convoy of black SUVs belonging to the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the New York State Police. I stood across the street, leaning against a rental car, a paper cup of warm cider in my hands. The autumn air was sharp and smelled of fallen leaves and wood smoke. From this distance, I watched the federal agents enter the main building. 30 minutes later, they emerged, escorting 3 women. The first was Clara, her hair now heavily streaked with gray, but her eyes sharp and clear. The second was Evelyn, who walked with a fragile, hesitant step but held her head high. The third was a younger woman, the 6th canary, who looked around at the open sky with an expression of disbelief. They had been kept here under false diagnoses, forced to take heavy sedatives, and isolated from the world through Addison's legal conservatorship. But the documents I had sent to Investigator Miller, combined with a federal judge's emergency warrant, had shattered those conservatorship in a single afternoon. The lawyers I had hired using my offshore funds were already waiting for them at a nearby hotel, ready to file a massive class action civil suit for kidnapping, medical malpractice, and systemic fraud. As Clara stepped into the waiting vehicle, she paused. She looked across the road, her eyes locking onto mine. I didn't move. I didn't wave. I simply raised my cup of cider in a quiet, solemn toast. She nodded once, a slow, profound gesture of understanding, and got into the car. My phone vibrated in my pocket. It was a news alert. Addison Pierce, CEO of Pierce Group, arrested at JFK Airport attempting to board private flight to non-extradition country. Federal prosecutors unveil 42-count indictment detailed in the Canary dossier. I smiled, deleting the notification. 2 weeks later, I visited the Federal Detention Center in Brooklyn. I didn't want to see Addison. He was already a relic of a past life, a man who would spend the rest of his days navigating the cold, unyielding reality of federal prison, where his money could buy him minor comforts but never his freedom. I was here to see Daisy. She sat behind the plexiglass partition, dressed in a drab orange jumpsuit. The vibrant, arrogant girl who had strutted through the executive suite was gone. Her face was pale, her skin sallow, and there were dark circles under her eyes. When she saw me, she didn't scream or rage. She simply picked up the phone. I sat down and did the same. "You're not in Zurich," she said, her voice thin and hollow through the receiver. "I came back to see the end of the show," I replied softly. Daisy looked at me for a long time, her eyes scanning my face as if searching for a script that was no longer there. The feed, it went completely black the day Addison was arrested, she whispered. "There are no comments. No viewers. No spoilers. Just quiet. It's so quiet in my head now, Nancy. It's terrifying." "That quiet is called reality, Daisy," I said. "There was never a system. There was never a male lead or a villainous. There was only a very powerful, very dangerous man who exploited young women and a group of women who had to find a way to survive him. Daisy's eyes welled with tears. Why didn't you tell me? On that first day, when you told me to tie my hair back, if you had just told me the truth, would you have believed me? I asked gently. She fell silent. We both knew the answer. If I had warned her, her live feet would have flagged it as a villainous trap. She would have ran to Addison, eager to expose my treachery, to gain more points with her system. Her arrogance, fueled by the delusion of her own protagonist status, made her completely deaf to anything but the sound of her own triumph. You used me, Daisy said, a faint trace of bitterness in her voice. You used me to take your place. I gave you exactly what you wanted, I replied. You wanted the male lead. You wanted the executive suite. You wanted the proposal.
I didn't force you to sign
those contracts. I didn't force you to ignore the warnings. You did all of that because you believed you were invincible. I stood up, placing the receiver back on the cradle. Daisy watched me, her fingers pressing against the glass. What are you going to do now? She called out, her voice muffled by the barrier. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. I walked out of the visiting room, through the heavy security doors and out into the crisp afternoon air of Brooklyn. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of deep amber and violet. The harbor breeze was cool, carrying the scent of salt and the open sea. For the first time in 5 years, I didn't have to plan my next move. I didn't have to worry about who was watching, who was listening, or who was coming to
take my place.
I walked down to the ferry terminal, bought a one-way ticket to the coast, and
stepped aboard.
Behind me, the city was a forest of glass and steel, glittering in the twilight. But my eyes were fixed on the horizon, where the water met the sky, vast, dark, and beautifully, wonderfully empty.